Deborah, here we are again in Paris after many, many months of absence. Back at the Institute, where we spent a very happy year before last. It seems as if we haven't really left. Lovely time to be back in Paris. Slightly unstable weather, but the terraces reopened last night, and there's a feeling of life sort of coming back to to its normal self. I'm delighted to be able to sort of chat with you.
Yeah, and we haven't stopped chatting, really, have we, Tash? It was such a pleasure to be a fellow here at the Institute with you, and we spoke non-stop about everything. And I wonder if we have anything to say right now. I mean, I wonder if you have a general writing note to yourself for any kind of writing, you know, non-fiction, fiction. You have a distinguished body of journalism.
Well, I mean, I think that the only writing note I really sort of have is a very general one, which you and I have talked about a little bit over these last months of numerous lockdowns, which is sort of how to maintain a writer's concentration, and that could be through numerous different things, and I feel that for me it is about achieving a sense of balance between solitude and company. A lot of writers like to go away and just sort of lock themselves away, but what keeps me afloat is conversations with other writers, other friends like you, and we've been very good about Skyping all these months, and occasionally just picking up the phone, even though we have nothing to report, and just sort of to keep in touch.
It's been an odd time, hasn't it? Because the pandemic is supposed to be. I mean, writers have told me that nothing has changed. Writers are always in lockdown, and I find this absurd because I found my concentration so fragmented. It's as if you sit alone and you cast your mind out into the world. And the world transmits something back, and one transmits something to it. And that was very difficult. That conversation was almost like a silence to me for the worst peak of the lockdown. I live between two hospitals in London, and the sound of ambulances,
of course, yes.
It was the main soundtrack to my life. I suppose a general note to myself is that it's desirable for my books to be more intelligent than I am, right? So what I mean by that is it would not be good if my books were more stupid than me. Some of my early writing is definitely more stupid than I am. But on the whole, I think that, what do I mean by that? There is something to find out when I write. I'm not writing to necessarily to win an argument or to be right. Obviously, I have opinions and arguments to chase and values. But if there was nothing for the writing to find out, I don't think I would do it.
There's a sense in all your books, and particularly the memoirs, of which the third volume has just come out. Congratulations, everyone's so excited. I've loved it. There's a sense in which this whole dialogue that you have with your writerly self and with your books is very present. I mean, that sense of evolution in Real Estate, the latest of your three memoirs. You address yourself very, very sort of in very sort of stark terms. You look back across time and talk to yourself 20 years earlier. Sense of time passing and sense of evolution, and there's a very active sort of process of self-interrogation, isn't there?
Interrogations of all kinds. I mean, I think what we share in our writing, as very different writers, is an interest in insiders and outsiders, and who we give voice to, and how we do that. And in silence and the transmission of silence, a very noisy silence, for personal reasons, historical reasons, and all of that. Well, I don't call them memoirs. I've made up this term, living autobiographies. So why? Because I don't want these 3 books, so they're a trilogy, Things I Don't Want to Know, The Cost of Living, and recently Real Estate. I don't want them to be nostalgic. It seems to me that not all, but most autobiographies sort of start chronologically with childhood and work on with up, you know. So these are not chronological. In a way, they started as a dare, Tash. I had read Orwell's 1946 essay, Why I Write. And it's a very short essay. And there were 4 reasons that he located to explain to himself his motivation for hammering the typewriter: political purpose, historical impulse, aesthetic enthusiasm, and sheer egoism. I thought they were pretty good, and that I would steal these headings, and I would give them a spin from a female writer's point of view. So here was the shock. I type up political purpose, and the first line is, that spring when life was very hard and I was at war with my lot and couldn't see where there was to get to, I cried most on escalators. I thought, well, what's that got to do with political purpose? But there was definitely a connection, and I began to chase in the writing its connection to political purpose. And what's chasing the narrator, as I sometimes call her, who is myself, or quite a lot like myself, is her childhood. But we only get to that sort of in the middle of the book. So it's been really interesting to write in the first person, to find techniques to bring in other subjectivities, to try and find a voice that isn't too claustrophobic. That I, you know, that mysterious first person, that I. And that's something that you explore in your quite brilliant extended essay. I think, would you say?
Yeah.
The Face.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that?
That's, yeah, I mean, again, you know, this whole idea of a dare and a memoir were things that I sort of was playing with when I first started that. It was just supposed to be a sort of a love letter to a very small group of people whom I'd left behind, who I'm still sort of entangled with, thinking that I wouldn't be writing for anyone else apart from the people I'd grown up with, the people who were exactly my age, from very similar circumstances, and who would probably never even read this themselves because they were too busy with other things, or raising families and struggling in a country that, you know, just has a lot of, you know, in which life is a challenge, you know, daily life is a challenge. So I wrote with a certain kind of freedom, you know, that a writer can only write when she or he is not thinking about who's going to read this, really. So it was a sort of a private thing. And so in a sense, a lot of the things that attract me to your writing, although, as you say, we're very different writers, are things that I locate in my own writing, so that sense of political purpose, except the whole idea of politics becomes changed in our books, I think. So when one thinks of politics, one thinks of activists, one thinks of going into the street, one thinks of regime change and all these sort of things, except I feel that in our books it is there in a different form, which is linked to the act of, which you describe in real estate, of moving from a writer moving from one country to another, far from their original home, and trying to create a new voice, a new language, and a new regard, a new gaze. And it's also to do with a lot of silence, a silence that we've been carrying around all our lives, that is to do with precisely, this very complicated relationship with, our origins, and where we are now, and how we square the two, and physically where we live,
yes,
is very important. Which is why this whole idea of real estate, what is a writer's real estate, is something that is really at the heart of this new volume.
Yeah. So real estate. I'll just read an extract from the back cover. I imagined a house in which I could live and work and think at my own pace. But even in my imagination, this home was blurred, undefined. The odd thing was that every time I tried to see myself inside this imagined house, I felt sad. It was as if the search for home was the point, and now that I had acquired it and the chase was over, there were no more branches to put in the fire. It seemed that acquiring a house was not the same thing as acquiring a home. At the same time, there was something I still wanted to find out about writing character, in particular, a major female character. Gifting her life to a man is not something to be tried at home, but that is usually where it happens. So real estate is looking at this huge question of home in, first of all, a very literal way, a longing, a desire for a house. Then also a sort of fantasy house or houses. So all the unreal estate that she acquires and furnishes. So these are like utopias in a way, aren't they? Yeah. And this is the only way a utopia really interests me. The ways in which we can put out a table and some chairs around the table and invite some friends and strangers to the table. Well, this is the beginning of sort of designing a life that feels good. And so modest utopias are of huge interest to me, humble utopias, by which I mean the ways in which we, I'm going to use that word, design the places we live in, and the moods we create in them. So my books are always about the harsh realities of life, and then they're also about imagined lives. So it seems to me that the other strand of real estate, it asks a question: if the patriarchy is the mansion built on land, it owns the deeds, are women trespassers or tenants on that land? Then there's another strand, which is something we share, a long journey from the land of our birth to somewhere else. So that rupture how to describe that, and so on. So it's a huge subject, and it's the subject that you explore in Strangers on a Pier.
Yeah.
Where you explore the history of your own family's migration.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, just sort of as an aside, you know, a lot of our conversations over Skype this last year, we've talked a lot about, you know, this idea of making a home somewhere and what it means, not just in a sort of a general human sense, but as a writer, because I think this is what lockdown has really intensified, you know, as a conversation. If you're a writer who's come from somewhere else, where is your home? When borders close and you have to make a decision to base yourself one place or another, emotionally, you know, from a writing point of view, where is that home? Where is that place that you most belong? And this is a terrible thing for me, certainly, I think, and I suspect for you, being called upon to make that judgment. Where is your home? And you have to sort of nail your colours to the mast, as it were, and declare something that is absolutely impossible to declare, for me at least. And that's all of, you know, what goes into, has gone into Stranger on a Pier. And in fact, all my novels, in a sense, because people are divided, you know, in a way, they're trying to sort of establish a life in one sense, in one place, in one physical place, and also as, you know, a new person, you know, oftentimes, you know, a cleverer person than they were before, you know, you know, a more sophisticated person, a more worldly person than they were, than they were. And what is the past and what is the present? And that is, you know, why I wanted to write Strangers on the Pier in the way I did, which is that the act of capturing the kind of the evolution of a family over 100 years, even a very modest family, is a political act. You know,
Absolutely.
Of course, on the one hand, there is a very simple thing of just bringing to life, giving a literary presence to people who've never had a literary presence, and who don't expect ever to have one. And why should they? This is what my parents always say to me. You know, you have more interesting people to write about, is actually what they say to me all the time. Why do you want to know? And I guess it was pushing against that resistance that made the very simple act of writing about one's own family, for me at least, feel very radical. Even though it's really, there's nothing really radical about it. But, you know, I grew up in a system where there was no self-reflection. So one of the things that, you know, as I said earlier, very powerful for me in your work was this, you know, the fact that everything is being interrogated, including the self. And it's the one thing that, if you look at the sort of the countries of Southeast Asia, new countries built on new economies, built on a new narrative of the self, what the individual self is, what the national self is. It's all about avoiding self-interrogation. We don't want the where we were, we want what we are, what we would like to be. We want the utopian house where, you know, which is full of these absolutely beautiful things and artifacts, skyscrapers, and that is the narrative that we would like. But where's the other narrative of actually the struggling with daily life?
Yeah. Yes. So then, what kind of value does a writer give to inner life, and the way it speaks to the realities of life? So they're usually in opposition, actually. Interesting. But you've extended now. Stranger on a Pier. Can you talk about that?
Yes, it's coming out in September, and it's really, the idea was just, again, it started out as a tiny little sort of a letter to my grandmother, with whom I was very close, but also not close at all, in the sense that what she and my parents wanted me to do was to achieve certain things through which they could measure my ascent into middle-classness, and therefore vicariously live that ascent themselves. And so really, all the things they encouraged me to do were things that would and make me more distant from them, and my grandmother in particular. So, in a sense, I measure my closeness, my inheritance from her and from my parents, not in financial terms because there won't be any, but in a certain sort of sense of separation. That's the legacy she's given me. She's given me sort of the tools to be able to live separately and to sort of live a whole separate existence, which is so far from her own that it creates a certain closeness, because that was always what she expected. And so, in writing a little love letter to her, and it really sort of happens in one afternoon, I described sort of having a conversation with her, where all these things, the final conversation I ever had, the last conversation I ever had with her, was one in which all these sort of things that she never talked about came tumbling out. And as she was talking, I started to think about how I had changed over the years too. And so in many ways her life was a very early prototype of the lives of women that you describe in your books, surrendering to someone who, who was really the main figure. Although really behind the scenes, everyone gravitated towards her. She was the cleverer, certainly, funnier, warmer. And yet she never held the title deeds to the house. She never held the title deeds to,
very common.
to the real estate of society. And as I described her life, I thought about how I had changed and how that change was really influenced by moving from one country to another, and how, in Britain, which is where I did my university studies and sort of stayed on afterwards, and my position was very different from the one I had growing up in Malaysia. And so really, it's just tracing, my evolution against hers, and seeing how actually there's so much similarity despite the separation, and a lot of it is to do with a shared sense of silence. That silence again that you referred to earlier, which is everywhere in your book. Which is something very, very appealing to me about that, the way that writers deal with silence, especially when they've left one place to go to another. There is something always unexplored, and we're always trying to get back to that silence.
Well, it's a very noisy silence, isn't it? And so we listen to that noise, and then it's often so much more interesting than what's difficult to articulate is so much more interesting to chase as a writer. So in life, the most articulate person in the room isn't necessarily the most interesting person in the room to me. And then on a bigger level, that transmission of silence. I mean, if I think about my paternal grandparents and the long journey they made from Lithuania to Cape Town, arriving in 1908, well, what a journey that is, right? So when they arrive, I've never written about this, so these are very select living autobiographies, which, by the way, my wonderful publishers in Sweden said, well, we can't call these living autobiographies because it sort of suggests that the book itself is alive, as if there was some sort of animistic so I said, well, that's good, isn't it? You don't want a dead book. And I've made up that word anyway, but this idea of the sort of alive book seemed to me to be the way to go. Anyway, when my grandmother arrived, she was from Lithuania to Cape Town. She was 12 years old. Her mother had died when she was about 2 years before. Their estranged father was living in Cape Town, and her name was Miriam Lear, and it was changed to Mary. And when she met her husband, his name was Abraham Moses, my grandfather, and his name was changed to Mark. So I know that Mary and Mark, you know, were avatars to protect them against the anti-Semitism of that time. But it always, you know, and my grandmother spoke with this Yiddish accent, so she was Mary Poppins, but with a Yiddish accent. And my interest in names, the sort of that's in all my novels. It preoccupies me all the time. This sort of slide of identity in names. So you can go from Abraham Moses to Mark. Is so interesting to me. That's a subject for a book in itself.
Oh yeah, or many books, absolutely.
And many books. So what was the question?
There wasn't a question yet, but there is one coming, which is, are you able sort of, I know you just said it's really difficult, if not impossible, to articulate that silence, but are you able to sort of describe it in vague terms? What is that? What is your particular kind of silence? What does that involve?
Oh yes, because the whole point of writing, to me, is to give voice to that silence. So, you know, I explore that in Swimming Home, I explore that in Hot Milk, I explore it in all my books. So, you know, obviously what is not said is mostly what is interesting to me as a writer. Yes.
But is there a particular, does that silence revolve around a particular thing, a particular experience, a particular part of your life?
Silence is
or is it just a more general silence?
Silence, it seems to me, is mostly to do with pain. It's mostly to do with shame. It's to do with awkward and humiliating feelings. It you know, so those things are my subject.
Sure.
And then, sort of aesthetically, in the writing of a book, it's important to me to create a sort of stillness, I suppose, to play with surface and depth, so that in some ways you're not quite sure what you're reading. I like that as a reader myself, so I'm not interested in books that kind of shout at me, that are dogmatic. The point of writing, not the point, you know, the interest in writing for myself is to somehow open the mind, because as I write in The Cost of Living, you know, when you close the mind, you can be sure that someone or something has been reduced to nothingness. So, so that's the adventure, to sort of find something that might just tip the writer over the edge, but you know, it's the job of the writer to find techniques for that not to happen, hopefully, and then to sometimes feel less and to sometimes feel more. Another way of putting that would be to objectify or subjectify something. I'm not really interested in talking about writing in terms of narrative arc and character development and plot. Not that those things don't entirely preoccupy me, but they're not helpful, because in the sense that writing is very brutal, I think. You're either interested in how the writer thinks, or you're not. It doesn't matter how many clever books they've read. If you're not interested in how the writer thinks, you're not kind of inclined to keep turning the pages. So where one puts one's attention, who are we looking at, how are we looking, is sounds easy to say, but you know, it's what's most interesting. It's what most interests me as a reader and writer.
Absolutely, it's about, you know, that bond, that sort of incredible, that sort of very, you know, the invisible bond between the reader and the writer, and how the writer establishes that. I mean, the only reason I ask about, you know, the particular shape of that silence and whether it has its roots in something is that it's taken me a long time to identify the roots of my own silence, but now I'm very clear about it, and you know, the moment one is sort of, one starts to notice a particular shape of silence and its roots, one becomes obsessed by it, and you're always trying to see, you know, I'm always trying to sort of spot it in other people's work, which of course is, you know, this is a terrible act of projection. You want everyone's silence to take on the same form as...
So tell me about your silence being clearer to you.
It's clearer to me now that the silence is to do with all the things that were not talked about
of course,
when I was a child, and actually even now in contemporary, I would say contemporary Southeast Asia in general. I don't think that's you know, it's not an overgeneralization. I would even say in a lot of immigrant communities, it's all certainly Asian immigrant communities, and again, that's not a generalization, because it really, empirical evidence has shown me that, you know, it's very, very common. This refusal to think about where we're from, because the where we're from is tied to a colonial past, being subject to someone else's desires and someone else's, you know, whims often. It's tied to poverty, it's tied to the erasure of the self that you talk about so eloquently and so in a very different context. It's tied to all sorts of things that interfere with the narrative of that utopia, you know, that
absolutely,
that nascent utopia.
And you embody this in We the Survivors, with your leading male protagonist, Ahok.
Yes.
Could you say something about the sort of the writing of him?
Yeah, and We the Survivors is, you know, absolutely about, you know, the duality of this life, where, you know, you have on the one hand, you know, the grit and the difficulty of life and the harshness, and on the other hand the utopia, which he's supposed to be part of but really isn't, and, you know, he finds himself really mired in the reality that is Southeast Asia, which is that, you know, he can work as hard as he wants and he just isn't going to get anywhere, and the same fate awaits his children and probably his grandchildren.
You have this exquisite beginning to that book, on the first page, I think, in which he's thinking about success and failure, how they entwined like trees.
Absolutely.
Would you read it?
Yes. You want me to talk about life, but all I've talked about is failure, as if they're the same thing, or at least so closely entwined that I can't separate the two. Like the old trees you see growing in the half-ruined buildings in town, roots clinging to the outside of the walls, holding the bricks and stone and whatever remains of the paint together, branches pushing through holes in the roof. Sometimes there's nothing left of the roof, if you can even call it that. Just fragments of clay tiles or rusty tin propped up by the canopy of leaves. A few miles out of town, on the other side of Kappa, headed towards the coast, you'll find a shop house with the roots of the jungle fig creeping down the front pillars of the building, the entire structure swallowed up by the tree. The doorway is now just a shadowy space that leads into the heart of a huge tangle of foliage. Where does one end and the other begin? Which is alive and which is dead?
I think that's astonishing writing. I love how turbulent it is and how calm it is simultaneously, and how you build his inner life. Camus was an influence.
Camus, obviously, you know, it's Camus, but also, you know, Duras, in the way that you talk about in your books, and really for that sense of dislocation and that sense of actually confusion of living a life that is not at all the life you're meant to live.
Yeah.
society has got things figured out for you, but actually what you want to do is, live something else altogether, and actually what you're forced to do is to live something else altogether, and it's that tension that produces, a lot of very beautiful passages in real estate. Are you going to treat us to?
I think we can finish by reading just a page from The Cost of Living.
Wonderful.
Actually, there's a Duras quote. I know a writer we both hugely admire. You're always more unreal to yourself than other people are. That's from Practicalities, as it's translated into English. As Orson Welles told us, if we want a happy ending, it depends on where we stop the story. One January night, I was eating coconut rice and fish in a bar on Colombia's Caribbean coast. A tan, tattooed American man sat at the table next to me. He was in his late 40s, big muscled arms, his silver hair pinned into a bun. He was talking to a young English woman, perhaps 19 years old, who'd been sitting on her own reading a book. He invited her to join him at his table. At first, he did all the talking. After a while, she interrupted him. Her conversation was interesting, intense, and strange. He said, "You talk a lot, don't you?" She thought about this, her fingers combing out the ends of her hair. It was not that easy to convey to him, a man much older than she was, that the world was her world too. He had taken a risk when he invited her to join him at his table. After all, she came with a whole life and libido of her own. It had not occurred to him that she might not consider herself to be the minor character, and him the major character. In this sense, she had unsettled a boundary, collapsed a social hierarchy, broken with the usual rituals.
I love the opening of that book, and her story is about being sort of abandoned and by being separated from the boat that she was and people she was with, and being left in a sort of slightly perilous situation, and which involved possibly a sort of the disappointment of someone she loved letting her down.
Yes.
And all that sort of just wasn't sort of picked up on, and she tells him this. She doesn't really care if he's listening or not. And she insists on telling the story, and he just fails to appreciate it.
You talk a lot.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that thing about unsettling social hierarchies and breaking with the usual rituals in all our work is something we share. Do you agree?
I think so, very much so.
Yeah. And maybe we should now have a cup of coffee.
I think we need more than a cup of coffee. I think the terraces are open. I think we should head off, and maybe, it's not too early for
I accept
early
your
lunch.
invitation.
Fantastic.